Hey everybody, Elizabeth Nader back with you, the Nader Narrative and Jersey First TV. One of the most important things we focus on at Jersey First is education. We do so much work to make sure that we're fighting for the people of New Jersey to understand what's going on in the education space and what things they need to be worried about. But it's not breaking news for us to say to you that this new sex ed curriculum is a big deal. Parents are very concerned. Teachers are even concerned. School boards are overwhelmed focusing on what they're supposed to do with these standards that were put together in June of 2020 by the State Board of Education. It's a very critical issue for us to understand. And there's so many different ways to look at this issue. We want to educate you. And to that end, we're bringing on someone tonight who some of you have seen before on some other programs that our senators put together, but we're bringing on someone who can give you research. It's always good to be armed with data, not just emotions when it comes to an issue that is this critical. We want to talk about the research that's behind it. And really, in a lot of ways, the research that the people who put the curriculum together seem to rely on to say this is good. Is that research true? Does it really back their assertions that this curriculum is necessary? So to that end, I am so pleased to bring on today Irene Erickson to help us understand this issue from a research standpoint. Irene, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's good to be with you, Elizabeth. I'm really honored to be on your show.
We're honored to have you. You have a great deal of experience, and I want the audience to understand what it is you do, how long you've been doing it, so they can see what your point of view is coming at this particular subject. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Okay, thanks. I'm a senior research analyst at the Institute for Research and Evaluation, which is a nonprofit agency that has been conducting evaluations of sex education programs in school classrooms for more than 30 years. We've done 100 studies, including many federally funded competitive contracts. And our institute has been an invited consultant at the U.S. House of Representatives, the Senate, the White House, the Department of Health and Human Services. And we've had our research articles published in peer-reviewed journals. I have been with the Institute for more than 15 years. I was an invited consultant to the landmark CDC study of sex education effectiveness that was done about 10 years ago, and I'm a co-author on that published paper. I've been invited to present our findings at the National Academies of Sciences, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the UN Civil Societies Conference in 2019. And I'm just happy to be here to share what I can with you today.
Well, that is a fabulous resume, and we are appreciative, certainly. And I think what's interesting in that, Irene, is a lot of parents in New Jersey are waking up to this curriculum that's been put together in 2020, but this isn't new, right? Some of it is more shocking than it's ever been. Some of it is new in terms of some of the content, I would say, but obviously you're in this research community. You've been looking at this for decades and been assessing sex ed curriculums for a while. So it's not as though this is a new topic. It just feels as though, Irene, they've really stepped up in how shocking the content is than ever before. And do you see that in terms of the details of what they're trying to push?
Well, yes and no. I would just say, the basic sort of concept of sex education that is in most school classrooms in the US and even internationally is something called comprehensive sex education, which is a term that refers to an approach that is what we would call sexual risk reduction, not risk avoidance. So the abstinence programs are risk avoidance. These CSE, we call it comprehensive sex education, is risk reduction. So their emphasis is on preventing teen pregnancy and STDs through reducing the risk using condoms and contraception, and sometimes recommending other things that are supposedly safe. So, that's what we're talking about. And the content has been kind of, graphic and shocking all along in some of the programs. For example, one producer, or one of the major purveyors of these programs, they have been teaching 12-year-olds in mixed boys and girls classrooms for decades how to, put a condom on a life-size model of a penis. So, and to shower together is okay, So there's been, a lot of this kind of going on under the radar screen, and parents just haven't been aware.
So it has been shocking. We just happened to really step on the shocking part of it, on the gas a little bit more with the shocking part of it, I think, with the addition of some things. But you're saying it's already been controversial, and it's already been something that parents have been dealing with. And I just want to remind everybody, when Irene talks about CSE, that is the continuing sexual education, comprehensive sexual education.
Comprehensive, or think of it as contraception based or condom based sex education, because that's really actually more descriptive.
And it's been there for a while. When I was in school, the focus was, like you say, on preventing teen pregnancies or using contraception or whatever that is. And the big argument back then was that versus abstinence training and teaching. So let's get into some of the, you've got 3 main areas I know you want to talk about, and you've got a lot to share with us, Irene. So let's get into your first area about really the research that's behind this curriculum.
So if you've heard about comprehensive sex education, you've probably heard that it's evidence-based, that it's been proven effective. Okay. And so that's what I thought too, until I started reading the research studies. And as I did, I discovered what I've come to call kind of a smoke and mirrors problem with research in this area. So what we found is that when you read the results of the studies that are actually designed to test the outcomes of these programs, so I'm talking about what we would call experimental design studies, not correlational studies. So when you read those studies and you look at them through a lens of scientific evidence of effectiveness, what you find is that there are very few sustained outcome effects. There are very few effects for the intended population, meaning, the audience that you're sold the program for. There are very few effects on the most protective outcomes, like abstinence, condom use, STDs, and pregnancy. And there are more negative effects than you've been told. Okay. So we did a major review of this whole body of research. 30 years of research, okay, was published in 2019 in a peer-reviewed journal. And we looked at the US and international. We took the studies that were recommended as credible studies by the CDC, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the UN. So we took their studies, we did not cherry pick the data, and we read the studies, okay? And so out of 103 studies of school-based comprehensive sex education, we found 6 that met this standard of sustained effects more than 6 months past the end of the program on the intended population. So it was not just on boys only, or Spanish speaking only, or whatever. Effects on either abstinence, condom use, STDs, or pregnancy, and without also causing side effects that were negative, like it might increase condom use, but also increase sexual activity rates, okay? So when you put all that together, you get 6 out of 103 studies showing evidence of real effectiveness. And we found 17 studies that had negative effects. So that was confirmed in a sense, not literally in the article, but this CDC meta-analysis that I was involved with, that I mentioned, when they looked at the school-based programs in the US, they found no statistically significant effects for condom use, no increase, no significant effect on teen pregnancy or on STDs, which is remarkable when you think about it. And of course, you didn't hear that in any headline news, reports. But So what they do to claim these programs are proven effective is they lower the bar. They bring the standards down. So they say, okay, if we increased teen condom use 3 months after the program's end, but that improvement or increase was gone at the 6-month time measure and the 12-month time measure, it doesn't matter. The 3-month effect, it was evidence of program effectiveness. Whereas for most people, that would be evidence of ineffectiveness,
Sure.
that it was just a short-term effect. And for a school-based program, you want the effect to last a year, from one school year to the next. So they get the program in the fall, and you want them to either reduce their sexual activity or increase their condom use, and get them through the senior prom night parties and sleepovers and the graduation parties and the summer pool parties. But if your effect doesn't go beyond 6 months after the program, you're not going to have any effect on those things, So one school year to the next is the standard we look at for an effective program. Very few programs have met that standard.
And that makes so much logical sense that would be the standard. And you're listing a lot of things that were sort of the reasons behind or the goals behind the CSE in the past. Our new curriculum adds in even more with gender discussions and all of that. And so they're sort of you're indicating they're sort of setting these milestones or these things that they want to achieve, and they're trying to make the case that these programs have been proven effective. And you're saying that very few of the studies support that. And in fact, this is, from a scientific standpoint, a lot of smoke and mirrors.
Yeah. Now, let me mention that this smoke and mirrors problem is being seen now in the transgender research. I'll give you 2 examples. There was a study in 2014 done in the Netherlands at a gender clinic, and they looked at the administering of cross-sex hormones to teenagers and its impact on mental health, on, psychological problems. But the study had no control group. It was not a representative sample, and the sample size was very small. 32 kids were in the group that was looked at for mental health outcomes. But when you break that into positive and negative outcomes, the numbers shrink into smaller groups, so that you've got a subgroup of kids getting, negative effects of 12 kids. So 12 kids in a flawed study have become the justification for the administering of cross-sex hormones to teenagers worldwide. I mean, this study has been the standard study. Wow. It's crazy. And here's another more recent example, a study that's being widely cited as evidence that cross-sex hormones given to teenagers reduce suicidality, which is a hot topic. And so this study found that the teens who received these hormones had lower or fewer suicidal thoughts, okay? But their actual suicide attempts were not lower. They were not lower. And in fact, suicide attempts requiring hospitalization were not lower. But what got reported in the abstract of the study, which is all that anyone reads, is that the suicidal thoughts were reduced, okay? So this became the headline. Giving cross-sex hormones to teens reduces suicidal thoughts. Well, suicidal attempts were not reduced. And in fact, when you looked at the older teens, the suicide attempts were twice as high for the teens receiving the hormones. But they did a statistical manipulation where they raised the level required for statistical significance to a higher standard than is normally required in research, social science research, so that they didn't have to report it as a statistically significant effect. Wow. But by most standards, it was an increase in teenage suicide in this same study that's being cited as evidence that cross-sex hormones reduce suicidality. So it just shows you how, I call it smoke and mirrors. That's being
Sure.
kind, I think, in some
Well,
respects.
I think that is being kind. I would use the word manipulation of data. We've heard so much in the past 2 years about trust the science, trust the science. The truth is, Irene, when you looked at the science does not support their claim that this is effective. There is real science there, there is real research there, but to twist it and manipulate it and cherry pick and put what you want in the abstract is all misleading. So we know that there really isn't research to support this, even though they claim otherwise. It's bigger than that, though, isn't it? Because your second point, I believe, is about the agenda behind it, and
Yeah,
this is very
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, but these are intertwined. So what I've noticed in my years of being involved in this is in the last 5 or more of just recently, last 5 years or so, the agenda has changed for sex education. It used to be that the focus was on sexual health. Now the focus is on sexual ideology. The Sexuality Information and Education Council of the U.S., SIECUS, their motto is sex ed for social change. Now they've changed their motto. It's sex ed for social change. And so now the focus is on sexual ideology, and it's on a real kind of changing of the view of sexuality itself, of teen sex. So kids are being taught that they have a right to sexual pleasure, that sex is fine as long as you have a consent and a condom, the 2 C's. You are, and then the other elements of this are deconstructing the heterosexual family and the kind of gender ideology, that whole set of ideas, promoting that. And then also this idea that sex education needs to start very early with young kids in kindergarten. So there's a new study that's come out that's being cited as evidence for all of these things, okay? And it was published in 2021, Goldfarb and Lieberman. And they claim that there's strong evidence that for these things. But I did what I always do. I read the study. I read their study, and then I read the studies they cite as evidence for these claims. They have like 80 plus, studies that they cite as evidence. Well, so that the title of their study is, their review is 3 decades of research, the case for comprehensive sex education. So they claim that comprehensive sex education, or CSE, is producing all these other good benefits. It's reducing child sex abuse. It's reducing dating violence. It's reducing bullying, okay? Well, so I went in and read those 80 plus studies, and what I found was more smoke and mirrors. Of those studies, only 80% of them are not studies of comprehensive sex education or of any type of sex education, okay? They're studies of other things, other types of interventions, but they're cited as evidence for comprehensive sex education. 80% of these 80 plus studies, okay? Then when you look at the few studies of actual comprehensive sex education programs, most of those do not meet scientific standards for evidence of effective studies or credible studies, okay? So like 90% of them are not good studies, okay? They're not, some of them aren't even studies. They're, they give us, or what am I trying to say? They give a gay fairy tale book to children in 3rd grade, and they read it together in the class, and then the teacher discusses it with them and writes up a little report about it. That's not a study, that's not evidence of effectiveness. So anyway, so they cite all these things that are not credible evidence. Right. And basically there's no evidence in their report that sex education is beneficial to young children, to kindergartners, is either beneficial or harmful, to be fair. Right. There's just no evidence. I mean, sometimes you can say there's no evidence because you've tested it in a study and gotten no effect. Sometimes you have no evidence because there's no study, okay?
Yeah.
And there are no studies of sex education that teaches about sexuality, transgenderism, homosexuality, or social justice to young children, okay? There just aren't any studies. So what this means, Elizabeth, is that if you interject this kind of content into these classrooms of young children, you're experimenting on those children. You don't know what the results are going to be. There is not evidence for it, okay? So that's an important thing for parents to know.
So we are running a big experiment. It's a big experiment. And your point is well made that not only is the evidence not there, clearly without the evidence, it's about the agenda. And even the transition that's happened over the past few decades from focus on sexual health to now really sexual ideology and a social agenda. And so we don't have the evidence. We have an agenda, clearly. And that agenda is really to experiment, is really ultimately ending up in an experiment on these young children. We do not know the effects of this kind of education on them. And we won't know that for some time.
Yeah.
That, I have to tell you, is frightening.
Yeah. Ironically, I mean, this Goldfarb and Lieberman study did a great job of reviewing the existing research, and they came up with no studies of this. And yet, here's what they say. I was just going to read this to you in their write-up of this study. They say that, and this is in their discussion, so it's not, they're not citing evidence here. The early grades may in fact be the best time to introduce topics related to sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and social justice, before hetero and cis-normative values and assumptions become more deeply ingrained and less mutable. So they're telling you what the agenda is right there. It's to get to these kids as early as possible and reprogram, you know, their brains.
Right. Before their parents can impact them, before you know, norms of society can take hold or whatever. The agenda is right there. So it wasn't difficult for you to find that. So we've got no evidence to really, no good evidence to support this. We have, and that's even going back in the old way of doing CSE, if you will.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right. And now we have a much more intensive and younger grades for the new CSE, and especially in New Jersey, you know, we're facing that. And at this point, clearly this agenda is coming out. So what do we have studies proving that alternatives work to CSE? Has anyone bothered to say, you know, instead of this curriculum, does abstinence teaching work? There have to be studies on that.
Yeah. So we did a review of the abstinence studies that were available, again, endorsed by the studies endorsed by these three agencies. And we got better results. We only had enough studies in the US to compare US to US. We couldn't compare them internationally. But in the US, you know, where we had 60 studies of CSE, we only had 17 studies of abstinence education. So the amount of evidence is smaller, but the ratio is better. We had 7 out of the 17 studies that showed evidence of effectiveness, these sustained effects on the intended population for a protective effect without also producing negative or harmful impact. Compared to out of the 60 CSE studies, there were only 3 of those that met that standard. So the ratio was higher for the abstinence programs. But to be fair, it's not enough evidence to drive a national agenda at this point. We need more evidence and better evidence.
We do have some discussion about parents as well, don't we, Irene, in terms of, and I don't know if that's evidence-based or research-based, but when parents are involved?
Yeah, there's good evidence that when parents are involved in these programs, and the way they're usually involved is like they'll give homework assignments for the kids to go home and talk with their parents and do something together. And also they'll provide a, you know, like an evening meeting for parents where the parents will receive some training as well. And those are better, more effective generally, those types of programs. I was just going to mention that talking about this agenda, let me see, let me get my train of thought. you know, the American Psychological Association. So let me put it, I want to talk about the sexualization of children because that's a hot topic. And the opponents of this new agenda of, this ideology and this indoctrination, they say that it sexualizes children and even makes them more vulnerable to exploitation. And the proponents of the agenda, this new agenda, say there's no evidence of that. So I want to talk about the evidence that we have. The best response I would give is that we don't have evidence that it's not happening, okay? And some evidence that it may be happening. So as I already mentioned, there's no evidence that teaching kindergartners about sexuality, transgenderism, homosexuality, we don't have evidence that that's harmful or beneficial, okay? But we're experimenting, with that. So we have to be, clear about that. But there is this thing called sexualization that we're concerned about. So the American Psychological Association, which is no right-wing, advocacy group, they're very liberal, in fact. They did a study in 2007 of the sexualization of girls. And they defined sexualization as, let me see, I want to get this right. They defined it as, where is it? Where a child is taught that their value comes primarily from their sexual appeal or behavior, or that they are an object to be used for the sexual pleasure of someone else, or that sexuality is inappropriately imposed on them. That's a quote from them. Sexuality is inappropriately imposed. So we don't have any studies of the impact of comprehensive sex education on the sexualization of this concept of sexualization. We don't have studies about that. But what we do know is that many CSE programs are very comfortable recommending sexual contact between children as young as 12. This Goldfarb, that's one of the authors of this study, she is a co-author of a CSE program that actually recommends to 12-year-olds that that bathing together and mutual masturbation are important things because they allow you to get acquainted or connected to each other without risking STDs or pregnancy. And this is almost a direct quote. I've looked this curriculum up online and I've, cut and pasted it. The Jamaats, who were one of the biggest purveyors of CSE for decades, they have been telling kids for decades that it's okay to shower together. And they'll say things like, to encourage condom use, make it fun, hide a condom on various parts of your body and get your partner to find it, okay? That's an actual, quote as well. The UN and Planned Parenthood have been teaching teens that they have a right to sexual pleasure. In fact, the International Planned Parenthood Federation has published a booklet, I have a copy of it in my office, called Healthy, Happy, and Hot. And it is written to teenagers who have HIV. And in that booklet, they tell them that they have the right to sexual pleasure, and therefore they have the right to decide when and how to tell their partner that they have HIV. What that means is when you say you have the right to decide when to tell your partner that you have HIV, that means you can have sex with them before you've told them you have HIV, okay? Yeah. So in my opinion, this is just opinion, all of these kinds of messages say to young girls, your value, having sex is an important part of your relationships with your peers. And your value is a function of your sexual availability. And in my view, that is the very definition of sexualization that
Sure.
the APA was concerned about.
Right.
And what they found was that this sexualization was harmful to their academics, their emotional health, and their physical health. And so I think we do, in a sense, have have a study that shows that these kinds of things are very harmful.
Well, you're basically telling these kids at the youngest age, even in kindergarten, that it's really all about sex, right? That their value is somehow tied to their sexuality, to their whatever gender they're feeling. I mean, it's this focus on an area that we don't focus on at those
And
ages.
the most important part of your identity has to do with sex, rather
Right.
than something else, like your intrinsic value as a person,
Right.
your kindness,
Yes.
your creativity, you know,
Right.
what a good friend you are, you know, any of those things.
All those things that build self-esteem, that give you a purpose, that give you a vision for your life, the things that help build you up and bring you into then puberty when all the confusing things can happen. This is frightening to me. And I think what's critical is that, you know, parents are obviously emotionally responding to this, understandably so. So am I. But when you look at it from a scientific standpoint, as you have done, it's very hard for anyone, I believe, to stand on the other side and truly support this without admitting to an agenda. And ultimately, Irene, it does appear as though we're fighting that. I have heard people for the other side make a claim that children have an unconscious bias and that that's what they need to fix. Is there any evidence that children are born with some sort of, what is that? What bias towards what?
Yeah.
Against?
You know, I have to just acknowledge that that's not an area of expertise for me, but I would challenge people to show us the studies. I mean,
Right.
we need to see the study and then read it. Okay.
Right.
You can't just take their word for it. There's a tremendous conflict of interest that's kind of the dirty little secret underlying a lot of this. For example, about half of the studies that made it on the Department of Health and Human Services list of approved, you know, studies during the Obama administration, about half of those studies were conducted by the program's author, who is selling the program to school districts all over the US. And even in this transgender, you know, world, the study that I talked about where they didn't share the findings about suicide attempts and rather just cited suicide thoughts as their evidence, that author of that study is funded by an agency that is funded by the companies that produce these cross-sex hormones. You know,
it's just it's all intertwined, and you have to look at the conflict of interest. You have to look at the agenda.
I mean, even Goldfarb and Lieberman, who's now the darling of this, you know, new agenda, because they're saying it's proven. They have, you know, Goldfarb is the author of 2 comprehensive sex education programs. So it's financially beneficial to her to find strong evidence for CSE and for this agenda, because this agenda is in the program she has written up.
Wow. Well, Irene, I have to tell you, it's shocking to talk to you. It's beneficial. I think we all need to be armed with this knowledge. I want to give you one last word. I know you come at this scientifically, and I so much appreciate that about you, but put yourself in the shoes of a parent in New Jersey. We're facing an onslaught that has really been overwhelming, of this really disgusting curriculum. So many things that I don't think we ever thought we would have to face, or words that we would hear said to our children. What would you say to all the parents in New Jersey?
Well, I would say, I guess, first, that there's no scientifically credible evidence that it's effective or beneficial. And so it is an experiment on your children. And that, you know, parent involvement has been shown to be very important. And so I would just support them. I know it's hard. I've gone to school board meetings where I was the only person speaking on the contrary side, with banners in the back, you know, hate is not a family value. And, you know, where I was worried about walking to my car after the meeting. But, you know, if not us, who? We have to do it. It's our children. And they need to be accountable to us, not the other way around. They need to show us the evidence. And, anyway,
yeah, you're right, Irene, you're 100% right. And, parents, we all need to remember that we are still the most important force in our children's life, but we have to claim that often. And, we're not only fighting for our kids, but we're fighting for those kids whose parents are either unaware, unable, or whatever,
or too worn out to go to the school board meeting.
Well, that's a good point.
Because they've been working 2 jobs to pay the bills,
Yep. It's all part of it. There's a lot of pressure out there. So we'll continue to shine light on this. Irene, at some point I would like to have you back, especially if anything comes out, anything new comes out, any studies, anything that you find, anything your group does, please contact us and let us know. We like to arm our friends and citizens and parents with information that's more than just emotional, because this is very emotional, but there's also science here that's on our side. And I think that's important to be armed with that.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Happy to come back.
Absolutely, Irene. We appreciate you so much. Thank you for everything that you have done and continue to do. And we will come back to you at another time. To my audience, please share this as much as you can and understand that the truth is on the side of parents. So we just need to be bold and loud and continue to use that information, and people like Irene working to prove what is really truth. So Irene, again, thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Oh, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
All right. Our audience will see you next week.